Last week, Moshe alerted us to a subject that needs attention, and that is it boils down to the subject of Hester Panim and how we're meant to understand the Holocaust and every other event that seems not the way our Ratzon would have it. Just a word of preface, and I think that Moshe pointed it out. We have a klal of Kol Mada Avid Rachmana Letav Avid. So we're working with a system of Tov that is behester. There's Tov beha'ara. So there's Tov that is manifest, and there's Tov that is hidden. They're both Tov, but we don't make the same bracha over them because they serve different purposes in the world. The ha'aras panim is meant to encourage and reward, and the hester panim is meant to provide the context for change. So the one is an encouragement to carry on, to strengthen, to encourage, and the other is to provide the trigger for change. So they're both Tov, but we relate to them differently because they are meant for different purposes. And just to get started, we need to recognize that the Hester Panim, that which is meant to trigger change, has more impact when it is miraculous. So just to make sure that we're clear about that. The mashal that the Vilna Gaon gives, that is brought, it's a famous mashal that there was a king who needed to punish his child because he felt that the prince was not conducting himself properly. And there were many dangers if he expelled the prince from the palace, not the least of which were other ministers and officers in the king's court who were jealous of the prince. So sending him out meant exposing him to the natural elements and exposing him to these jealous officers, ministers who were out to get him. So what the king did is he dispatched a group of his loyal servants to go out with the prince, but to remain hidden, but to protect the prince in the event that the prince was endangered. So first there was a bear that was beginning to attack, and suddenly one of these appointees stepped in and trapped or killed the bear. At a point not long thereafter, one of these other ministers attempted to sabotage the life of the prince, endanger him, and again, one of these appointees stepped in and saved the prince. The first time it happened, and maybe the second time it happened, the prince thought it was coincidence. But by the time it happened the third time, he began to detect the pattern. And the pattern that he detected is that clearly his father, although he sent him away from the palace, is looking out for him to make sure that he survives. And he was filled with a profound love for his father, who had sent him to who had expelled him and who was now protecting him. So the Gaon says that is the mashal of our existence in Golus, that we were sent away from the palace to do tshuva, and we are continuously being attacked. B'chol dor v'dor omdim aleinu lechalosenu. And the idea of the various ways in which we have been saved have been nothing less than miraculous. So you could focus on the incidents of the Hester Panim, or you could focus on the miracles. But which either way you do, you must recognize that the Hester Panim was meant to trigger tshuva. And here we get to the question of understanding that anything other than tshuva as a response to an incident of Hester Panim is referred to as achzarias. That's a cruelty because it invites further Hester Panim. So the Rambam refers to it as achzarias. It's a cruelty. And that cruelty is precisely why it is, to prevent that cruelty is why it is that we've been meeting on these meetings. Because there is a huge body of literature and discussion that does not acknowledge that the Hester Panim, particularly the Hester Panim of the Holocaust, but it could be any, the Hester Panim that is going on right now of Klal Yisrael being attacked from all sides, that this Hester Panim has only one function. The function is to trigger tshuva. And that's why we're meeting, because this seems to somehow have fallen out of contemporary discussion. And that it seems as though there's more focus on the chayil and the koach, that how to respond to these various attacks, instead of recognizing that the attack is only there to trigger introspection and tshuva. And this has been a sad and sorry state of affairs. And the reason why I felt that it was so important for us to gather and to talk about what it calls on us to do is because it is not so popular for reasons that are many. But I'll just mention one thing that we should recognize. Kadosh Baruch Hu is showing us what it looks like to be involved in a world where people are showing allegiance to anything other than Talmidei Chachamim, than Torah. There was recently a whole video, a production made that they were interviewing yeshiva fellows who were not going to the army to try to get their responses. And the responses were utterly confused, just utterly confused, as though the students of a yeshiva have an opinion about why they should or shouldn't be joining the army. It's wild. That's where we've gotten to. Instead of saying that there are Gedolim who ruled this way about engagement with a secular government, and there are Gedolim that ruled this way regarding engagement with a secular government, and Katonti, I don't have an opinion. I have a Masorah. You want to go speak to the people who are the Bali Masorah, by all means. Go speak to them and find out about the Masorah. But the idea that I have like and each one more confused than the next, one more just disorganized than the next. There are legitimate views of the Gedolim, and the thought that somebody has that's a response to a matter of enormous significance. And the reason it's so important to recognize this is because there were very few who understood what the threat in Europe was in the pre-war years. They did not understand that the Gedolim were saying something about how to distance ourselves from the secular world. They just they couldn't hear it. And the Gedolim were saying it. I would say that Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch was probably the most practical in terms of separating his community. But the Chassam Sofer, the repeated message, which is, we have an approach of how to deal with secularism. And that's the Masorah of how to deal with secularism. And it can't be watered down. There's nuances. How much emphasis should there be on Kiruv Rechokim? How much emphasis there should be on isolation? Those are matters for the Gedolim and for each stream of the Gedolim to determine. But there's a message. There's a message that we, as a community, as a klal, were being drawn in by a world that celebrated secularism. And what have we been shown since then? We've been shown what it looks like to have idealism. Nobody was more idealistic than Hitler. He articulated his idealism, and people who followed him religiously. And now we're being exposed to the Taliban and to ISIS and to all of these people they're pure idealists, willing to sacrifice absolutely everything, pure idealists. It's a message. Here's what it looks like. Here's what Mesiras Nefesh looks like. Back Nachzor le'inyanenu. The idea that we are able to determine if it's not something we like, if it's something that feels bad, it feels uncomfortable, it feels unpleasant, then it is a product of Hester Panim. Now, there are those whose relationship with their physical world has developed and evolved to the point where they no longer see privation as a hester panim. We're not going to talk about that tonight, but there are those for whom privation is not hester panim. It's ha'aras panim. We're speaking about those of us who call bad things bad and who experience bad things as bad, who are not necessarily evolved to the point where we see bad things as a gift. That's a separate level. But among those of us who feel sad or and relate to bad things as bad, we have the concept of Esther Panim. And so the point needs to be taken back. Of course, everything is Kalmad Avid Rahman Letav. That's the klal. And that tov can come either through ha'ara or through Esther. One to praise and encourage, the other to trigger a response of tshuva. And that's the way Klal Yisrael has operated since day one. Even those who have observed Klal Yisrael from the outside have recognized this pattern as the history of Klal Yisrael. Klal Yisrael is atypical in every sense, because when we rise and we're granted and we're showered by blessing, we are showered with blessing way out of proportion. And when we slip in our footing, we slip below anything. But I think that it's important to bear in mind that not having this orientation is very expensive. The statistics are that 40% of the inpatient residents in psychiatric hospitals are Jewish. If you don't have an orientation towards suffering, towards ha'aras panim, of how to absorb and how to deal with the shefa, and it goes to your head. And if you don't have an orientation of how to deal with hester panim, it doesn't trigger tshuva, it triggers anxiety and depression. Then it goes to your head. It's a very expensive thing to avoid. It's not a simple story to say, well, I try to live my life, and by the way, what do I do with the showering of blessing? And what do I do when things don't go well? I have coping mechanisms. That's a very expensive statement. It's not one that any of us can afford. There's no coping mechanism for dealing with ha'aras panim and hester panim other than intensifying one's relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. That is the only way to deal with hester panim and ha'aras panim, because that's the only reason they're there. They're there to intensify our relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And so it's not with the luxury, the communal message, the zeitgeist was that you could get by without having to be so intensely related with Hashem. You can get by with being somewhat tied in with Hashem, perhaps enough to satisfy your spiritual yearnings, and that's enough. You don't have to relate to the events in your life, neither the ha'ara or the hester, to intensify. That's more about just getting by. You want to have a relationship, a spiritual side, then that's wonderful. But that doesn't have to be dynamic. It doesn't have to always be intensifying. That's a very expensive position to take. It's one that leads inevitably to either cruelty or to psychosis. So the reason why we're meeting and the reason why we're promoting using the Holocaust as the paradigm, where every time we think about the Hester Panim, we have to ask ourselves, have I used the Hester Panim to intensify and bring and come closer in my relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, either as Avinu or as Malkeinu? And that intensification allows and transforms the Hester into Ha'ara. And so that's our tefillah. We're coming into the period of Avelus Derabim, where Klal Yisrael is going to remind ourselves about the Hester Panim associated with the loss of the Beis Hamikdash, which was the example of Ha'aras Panim. And what we take from that is the message that the Navi says: intensify your relationship with Hashem as the Baal Chesed. And so you do Chesed in emulation of Hashem, and that the Hashem is the Nosen Torah, and intensify your relationship with Torah. And that has to mean an intensification also of the relationship with those who are the Mosrei Torah, with those who have been given the job of passing on the Torah to each of us.